In this video, I'm going to discuss how to construct the channel. What is the channel? Channel is a conduit that I create in my watercolor paper pendants that allows the hanging material, in this case it's a piece of silk cord, to pass through. Notice it's totally flat on this side too. You don't see any indication that there's a hollow conduit in this area. And the piece literally floats on the cord. Now at the end of the video, I will show you how to pull the material through. That's a trick unto itself. To make the channel, you employ the lost wax method. So doing this will involve you buying some wax from a jewelry supply shop. And I'll list that in the written instructions that accompany this video. I'll list the place where I buy mine. Before my work evolved to incorporate channels, I hung pieces like this. I used a wire wrap technique. And it's a much more traditional way of doing it. Anyway, you also need the toaster oven to melt out the wax. And here's an example of the wax that I use. This is a little thicker than I would like to go. Between 8 and 10 gauge would be the best. This is 6. This is heavy stuff. Take this raw piece, which is still incomplete because I don't have the channel in place. I like to build the entire unit, including working in the channel before I apply the nice surface finish of watercolor paper. You know, in fact, I indicated there's something nice that could be used to finish this off. So what do? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 2 additional pieces of paper that are going to be used to create the channel. So using my template, I trace the shape 2 more times and proceed to cut it out. Notice that I'm cutting on a self-healing board. Good. So, I have 2 pieces. That's all I need. And these pieces will be glued. They'll be lined up and glued to the back. Okay, that's okay. A little off, but I think it'll be okay. I could correct that in the sanding. So these pieces are going to be glued to the back. And the wax is going to be positioned in its ideal location to correspond to the design. I'd like to point out before I continue that the wax, the reason why it's twisted like this is I don't have any 8 gauge wax left, and I need that thickness for an adequately sized channel. So I twisted a few pieces of thin wax wire together. And then what I'm going to do, position the wax where I want the channel to be. Now ideally on a piece like this, I'd like the cord to come out there and just about there. I think that'll look good because that flows with the line of the piece. It just makes sense for cord to come out. Let's see. You know, it'll look good. Cord coming out there and there. it establishes a nice continuity to my design. We will need to place the wax sort of like this. What's nice about the wax too, if you press it down a little, it'll hold its position. The wax is in place. Now I'm going to glue this up and apply the 2 additional pieces of paper that I cut. I don't have to worry about glue getting on the wax or anything like that because the wax is going to melt out and leave a cavity. I didn't bother to demonstrate in this video how to build up the watercolor paper pendant because you have already seen me do that in my videos entitled How to Construct a Watercolor Paper Pendant. Now we want to create the channel with my wax positioned exactly where I want the cord to be. Take my glue and fairly thick amount of glue. I glue up the piece. I want to make sure there's enough glue on this to adequately hold everything together. Make sure I have it lined up the right way. I'm also going to put glue on the watercolor paper. Now, it gets a little messy. That's okay. Artists like mess. Got to work it with your finger. I often dampen it a little. That helps form it. Notice how I'm pressing it down? I have a little bit of an issue here. I almost don't have enough space on the paper between the edge of the paper and my piece. I'll get it to grab, but it's close. It's very close. What do I mean by it's close? It's close to not working. I want the cord to come out there and there at the apex of the curve. That's where it'll look the best. And these edges are not cooperating. So the secret is to continue to press it down until it grabs. I have another layer of paper to glue down on top of this. It should be at least 2 layers thick. But the beauty of using wax is it melts out. So there's absolutely no problem creating a channel. I like to burnish it, usually with the back of a paintbrush. All right, we're just about ready for the next piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue up the additional piece of paper. Make sure I have it facing the right direction, and it is. Flip it over. This is the side I want to put the glue on. I'm gonna continue with the burnishing idea. I needed to turn off the camera and continue to work this for a good 5 to 10 minutes because it was refusing to stick. It kept on lifting up. So I took the round end of my paintbrush and I just burnished it constantly, pressing up against the wax, pressing the paper down. It worked. It's nice. It's grabbing the material is drying. Now, I want to point out there's a lot of irregularities here. The edges don't line up. It's rough. But this is the raw material that you're going to work into. Has to be bone dry. And then what I would do is start sanding it to make all of this disappear. Turn it into one homogeneous mass. After it's dry and after it's sanded to get rid of all the roughness and irregularities, I'm going to apply an additional piece of decorative paper to the back. That's what I do on all my pieces. I like what happens when the watercolor sucks into the decorative paper. That'll give it a finished look. On the front of this piece, color paper that you saw me prepare, I will glue. So it has its surface effects. Beautiful. Then more sanding. I'll paint up the edges, varnish it to any level of finish that I want. It's totally up to you how much varnish you want to apply. And then I'll bake out the wax. A few hours since I glued the backing paper on to hold the wax that will form the channel in place. Now what I need to do is continue to sand the piece and refine it. Remember what I said earlier, it's rough. It's the raw material that needs to be worked to a nice finished level of development. I can pinch off the excess wax that will form the channel and ignore it right now and just sand around it. Turn this into what I want to see, a beautiful sculptural form. Then, after I've done that, I can apply the backing paper and the top paper. And just one other thing, I want to show you how I deal with these concave areas. I'll either use a half-round file to get in there, and I don't happen to have one laying on the table over here, so I'll use some sandpaper. Also, I want a finer cut than my half-round file will give me, so the sandpaper is a better bet at this point. I don't have a lot of sanding to do. What I can do is roll the paper on a round object, like a pen, and sand. It gets in there nicely now and responds well to the curve. I've spent a little bit of time sanding it, maybe worked on it for an additional 20 minutes. I evened off all the edges. I rounded the corners. And it's just about ready for the final paper application, the top layer and the backing. So, for the back, I'm going to use this banana paper. That lines up nicely with that. Made to order. I'll cut that off. Make sure I have enough paper to cover the back. I do. I will double check to make sure it fits. And it does. And what I'm going to do now is glue the back of my piece. Position the banana paper. Why is it called banana paper? Because it's made out of banana peels. In fact, you see all of the fibrous textural elements from the banana peels. I also like to sandwich the piece in between a piece of paper towel. Sandwiching it in between a paper towel and then pressing down on the paper towel helps because it prevents me from getting glue all over my fingers and then transferring the glue back to the paper. Sops up any excess glue like we have over there. Can't really do much right now. Have to let it dry. And then I'll sand that right off and apply the surface watercolor. I'm going to go with that area right in there. While I'm waiting for this to dry, so I can continue to sand into it, I decided to cut out the piece. Get that ready. That'll be the top layer. Then I'll glue that on, let that dry, and I'll continue to sand it. We're moving into the final stretch, and that is, after it's all sanded, I varnish the piece as many times as I want to establish a really nice shine. And then I'll melt out the wax. I've allowed the backing paper to thoroughly dry. It's been sitting there for probably about an hour now, so it is dry. It's dry enough for me to file it off. This is the file that I used for some of the initial forming of this piece. And the half round side I use for the concave areas. The flat side I use to file down and establish the shape of the convex. So this file is ideally suited to quickly remove any excess backing paper. Notice I'm not filing back and forth like that. I'm pushing in one direction into the edge of the piece. If I was to go back and forth like that, I'd create a fuzzy edge. Angle it into the piece like this gives me a nice, sharp, clean edge. Here we go. It's taken me a while because apparently I used a lot of glue. I can also use, and which I prefer at times, my needle nose jewelry files. They're beautiful. They're sharp. And say for this area over here, nice way to clean it up. And of course, the finishing touch up is done with sandpaper. I will continue to work the piece until I'm thoroughly satisfied. But it's starting to come into its own. The next step is to apply the piece of watercolor paper, the top layer. Between glue applications, I should show you this, I leave my brush in water. I butter up the back of the watercolor paper. I'll also apply a little glue here. I want to make sure I get a nice bond between the top layer and the main piece. That brush, I just threw it back into the container of water. I'm going to lay it on, and what I'll do is take a clean piece of my tissue paper and sandwich it. I don't want to touch the surface of that paper with my fingers. I want to press it down using a piece of paper towel. Using tissue paper to hold down the piece of watercolor paper that I cut out from that prevents me from getting glue on its surface and messing it up. Still a lot of possibilities with this too. I like what I see. I don't hold it down too long with the tissue paper because I don't want the tissue paper glue into anything. So I'll remove the tissue paper. It's starting to stick. And examine what I have. Because the watercolor paper has been dampened by the glue, now it's starting to relax and conform to the shape that I'm gluing it to. And I'll continue. I just made sure everything was lined up nicely. It's important to look at what you're doing by removing that paper towel. This was sliding a little too far over, and although I could have fixed it with the additional application of paint, I want to try to get it lined up as closely as possible. Yeah, take a look. Close up view. Now that I'm certain that the watercolor is properly positioned, I'll hold it one last time with a protective layer of paper towel. I'm going to burnish the abstract painting onto the form to ensure that I have 100% contact. It's lined up nicely, and that feels good, and I'm going to have to just let it dry at this point. Sometimes I like to go over the edges, just to make certain. It's very damp, but it doesn't show any signs of lifting. What I'll need to do is, when it's completely dry, and it's going to take hours, to go over the edge with sandpaper, turn it into one smooth surface. Then I'm ready to paint the edge, or maybe I should say stain the edge with a little bit of watercolor. I like to dampen the back too, so the watercolor sucks into the backing paper. Then I'll proceed to varnish it. After I varnish it, the final step is to melt out the wax and to hang it. We'll put it down and let it dry. The top layer of watercolor paper is glued on and thoroughly dry now, and I also continue to sand the edge, refining the piece and smoothing out all of the individual layers so it becomes one surface. A little more in this area right here. Not much though. Beautiful. Yeah, that's a nice edge. That's a real nice edge. What I need to do now is dampen the edge and flow some watercolor into it. Here's a finished one. You can see what I'm talking about. I'm also going to dampen the backing paper and allow the watercolor that I'm flowing along the edge to seep into the paper. I like that random discoloration that occurs. Hard as a rock, because I baked it in the oven after I varnished it. think I'll do the same with this one too. And I'm going to devote an entire video to how to do a hidden channel like you see here. This is a raised channel. I like the way that looks. You know, it's personal preference whether you prefer that to that. Some people like that, some people like that. So, how do I go about the simple task of simply flowing some paint in? Well, I'll pull my palette over. This is the same palette that I use in my watercolor paintings. I start off by dampening the edge. It sort of primes the surface, gets it ready for the watercolor paint. And I could, if I want the color to flow into the backing paper, I can wet the backing paper. I'm ready. Take a squirt bottle and start to wet some of my paint. There we go, that's Antwerp blue. I'll flow Antwerp blue into the surface. Explain in a minute why I dampened the surface first. If I get paint on the face of my piece, it's an easy matter just to wipe it off like that. Now, what I like to do as I'm flowing in the paint is play around with my colors. See how it's bleeding into the paper? I really like the effects of accidents, you know. It doesn't look like I tried too hard. Just natural flow of color. Beautiful. Let me go to the complement, get some red. Yeah. Do the same thing. I don't want the edge to look raw and clean. I want it to be dark with a variety of intermingling colors. Maybe a little burnt sienna or brown madder would be equally good, but that looks like burnt sienna, so we'll take burnt sienna and flow it into the piece. I love that effect. What's happening in the back? Yeah, there we go. It's sucking in. Once again, I'll pick up some of that Antwerp blue, which is more or less the complement of burnt sienna.